But anyway, I've really, I've not wrestled with it school-wise. This opportunity came up when we were in Memphis with the kids last March. And the director of the program was at church Sunday morning and saw me with all these kids and said, "What are y'all doing here? You know, what's going on?" And he said, "That sounds like a doctor ministry project to me." He said, "I'm going to call you and see what you," and so we talked about it and, you know, just going to try to write all this up that we're doing with the kids in the inner city and why we do it from a biblical, spiritual worldview, you know, and then what we're doing and try to listen to other people and make it better. And I have wrestled with it the last few weeks with Dad, you know, just changes with that and everything. But yeah, we've all talked about it as a family. Susan is being maybe 2 or 3 days a week in the next few weeks, coming in to help Mom out. So yeah, so go to class Friday. I go to school Friday.
Exciting.
And I'm nervous to say that I got the syllabus, and it just doesn't look that hard to me. I know that I'm going to get slapped. I'm going to get slapped in the face for thinking that, for even thinking it's going to look too hard. Then I'm going to do the first assignment, and it's just going to knock me backwards about 30 feet. But we'll see.
You got this.
So anyway, just please be in prayer about that, and especially that we can get through 5 or 6 days I have to be gone, you know, and that nothing major happens those days. But yeah, just be in prayer about that, please. What else do we need prayer about? Anything? Everything. Pray about the whole world. Yeah. Okay. Hey, David, will you lead us in prayer?
Sure. Let's pray. Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for this study. We're so amazed at your word. We're so amazed at what you've revealed to us through Genesis all the way through Revelation 22. Your story is amazing. And the way we're perceiving what you're doing through a biblical spiritual worldview and about the temple and about the kingdom and about us being priests, God, is something that we need to grasp hold of and live that in our lives. We're so thankful for Tommy. Thankful for the opportunity he's having to further his education and to share what he has learned through all these years of working with other people and how that will help everyone. There's an attempt to help a lot of these people in the inner city and in other areas where there are needs. I'm just so thankful always for him and his ability and his desire to know you better and to share what he's learning with us. It's so important for all of us to learn what he says. So bless us tonight and continue to bless Arlington as we try to serve you in your kingdom. And help us not to, help us always to be sensitive to the people around us. And help us always look at Jesus as our example in everything we do. We pray all these things in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. So we're in Romans. If you want to turn to Romans 1, where 1 and 2 is where we're going to be tonight for a bit. Yeah, and this really and truly, I mean, that goes right along with why in the world is this so important? Lots of people don't think this is important. This is the handout from last week, and it really has a lot of really important background in Romans if you want that. But why in the world do we spend time studying an ancient book? After all, we live in a 21st century world, right? And a lot of things that humanity used to think and believe and practice and the ways they did things are of the past. And basically, one of the key elements of modernity. Modernity is you know? Because what's been dismissed is an overall truth. Okay? What's been dismissed is an overall story. The people who write about post-modernity write about that stories are kind of made up. And your story is your story, and my story is my story. But they're really not totally true, you know. And so they kind of apply that to every story and everywhere, you know. And we're kind of living in the effects of that right now. We're kind of living in those places. How do you navigate the world? There's not much solid ground to stand on, and so everybody's anxious, right? When there's not much solid ground to stand on, it's anxious. I remember the first time in California, when I was living in California, that the floor turned to jello. That was the freakiest thing I ever experienced in my whole life. I mean, the floor turned to jello. I was trying to walk across the floor during an earthquake, and nobody else cared. And I was like, we're all going to die, and this is the end of the world. And they're like, no, it happens every day. But it was the weirdest thing. But that's come to me to kind of represent, this is where we're all standing today in this world, in this society, in this culture. We're standing on a floor that's made of jello. And so everybody's anxious, and everybody's hopeless, and desperate to write a story that will work, because there's no story, and so we got to write our own, and it's got to work, you know. And then, man, there's so many different things you pile onto that that can really make it a lot harder. And so there's a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, all kinds of stuff in the world. And here's the whole deal: is that's not true. This is what I believe. I'm telling you now what I believe. I believe there is a story. I believe there is a way this world is. And I disagree with several other big stories about the world that say something different. I mean, this is kind of getting at what Jesus was saying is, there's no way, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and there's no way back to the Father except through me, when he's getting at that. Okay? And that has been taken and done mean, horrible, hateful things by people who follow Jesus. They can take his words and do those kinds of things. And Jesus never intended for that to mean, that means be hateful and don't like anybody who doesn't like me, and, you know, all these kinds of things. And kill people who don't believe in me and all this kind of stuff. That's not what Jesus was saying at all. But there's a story. Okay, so here sits a man in the first century at the time of, you know, Nero Caesar, or just before Nero. And he has been around the world telling a story. And his favorite word is, I've got some good news. I've got some really good news about to this world. And man, that sounds exactly like something that's needed today. You don't have to be anxious. You don't have to be depressed. You don't have to be hopeless. This world is headed somewhere. And what this Bible says is, all you have to do is watch these people right here, and they'll show you what the world looks like. They'll show you what a new world looks like. Just watch them, and then stop and ask them, and they'll tell you what a new world is. That's what Paul is saying here. And so we get to Romans, and Paul's written just about everything else he's going to write. Now, maybe he hadn't written Timothy yet, hadn't written 2 Timothy. Maybe he's written 1 Timothy. Probably has written 1 Timothy, or maybe about this time, where he's during the time that Greg was telling us about Sunday. He's in Macedonia, Achaia, that area, and he's been through 3 missionary journeys. He's just come out of a really tough time in Ephesus. And Luke gave us just a taste of it. Luke gave us a flavor of how hard it was, how wonderful it was, that the Spirit was moving so powerfully that Paul would walk around and people were burning books, and people were, you know, taking their pagan stuff and burning their idols and all this kind of stuff. But man, the spiritual forces of evil did not take too kindly to that. And they flat got after Paul, you know. And Paul says in 2 Corinthians, I thought I was dead. I thought in Ephesus I was dead. I despaired to death, he says. And he describes it a little more in 2 Corinthians as he writes and says, it was awful. And at the same time, just constantly on his heels all the time are these people that we've got to make this more Jewish. This is the Jewish story. Make it more Jewish. We can't lose the Jewishness of this. Everyone's got to be circumcised. Everyone's got to follow the Sabbath. And there he sits after all of this, and he's holding bags of money. He's holding money that the Gentiles have collected for the Jewish people in Jerusalem. And he's about to go back to Jerusalem and carry all of this with him. And he's got his, Greg was telling us, teaching us Sunday, he's got this band of people around him. They're all helping him carry it. And they, if I may use a term from today, they're a diverse group. It looks like the church ought to look. If you're Paul and you've been around the world, then come dragging in people from all over the world with you, And that's what's going on. And while he's there, he gets word. While he's in Achaia and Macedonia, he gets word that maybe from Aquila and Priscilla, maybe from other people like them, Paul, the church in Rome is got a problem. We're back in Rome safely. Claudius had kicked the Jews out. Nero had said they could go home. And while they're gone, the church becomes very Gentile while all the Jews are gone. And then the Jews come back and it's kind of like this instead of like this. It's kind of this going on instead of this. And Paul, maybe he'd already thought, I want to write to the Romans. Or maybe he thought, this is a good time to write to the Romans because I want to go to Spain. I want to go, I just want to keep going. Paul had this passion in him to keep going and going. And where can I go? If he got to Spain and God left him alive, he would have said, where's that ocean go? How far is the next land from that? Somebody's got to know about Jesus. And had God allowed it, Paul might have made it across the Atlantic. Who knows? And we don't know if he made it to Spain or not, but he had that passion in him. He had that drive in him that I've got to go to the next place. And he knows the practicalities too. I got to have support. And so he writes to the Roman church in the midst of this situation, and he's writing as an experienced, mature, been through it, been there, done that, got the t-shirt, everything, been through everything, got the t-shirt, and here's my reflection on what I believe. Here's everybody needs to know it. And I, like I said last week, and it's on that handout that some of you just got, he mentions in there several times in Romans, as we are so slanderously reported as saying, that he wants this Roman church to understand how to solve their problem, but he also wants to introduce himself a little bit better and tell the whole story of the gospel. I don't want to leave anything out, so he tells the whole picture. And so, what he does in Romans is, just here's the biblical spiritual worldview. Okay, here it is, from beginning to end. Here's how we think as Christians. And then by the time we get to Romans 14 and 15, he then says, now, you people are not getting along very well. How does this impact that? And that's what he does there. Let's get practical, if I may say. Let's get practical. But I think the whole thing's practical. It's practical to our lives and who we are. We need to know who we are. In this world, we are the people who are reflecting the Savior of this world. People don't have any hope without Jesus. How will they know Jesus if we don't show them? Because the culture is not going to show them. The television and the streaming services are not going to show them anything. Okay? We're it. We're the chosen representatives of God to show what good news in this world looks like. To show what the world to come looks like now. Okay? And so, man, we have to go understand who we are, where we are, what the problem is, what the solution is, and what time it is in a very strong way in the midst of this culture. We've got to. We've got to in our homes, we've got to in our jobs, and this is the place we come together and we can at least hear, if nowhere else, here's people like me. And it's like, oh, a drink of water, thank you. I've been walking through the desert all week. Whew. Here's a good, cool drink of water right here, or whatever it is. And to be reminded and deepened in that story. So here we are in Romans. I want to do one thing tonight before we watch a little bit of N.T. Wright. I want us to compare two questions, because I think this is a great way to introduce, and N.T. Wright's going to talk about this as the reason I'm introducing it this way. So here's two different questions I'm going to pose to us. All humans, granted that all humans have sinned, what's God going to do about it to fix it? Okay, that's one question. Just think about that question for a second. Granted that all humans have sinned, okay? And man, that's granting a lot, because that's granting that there is such a thing as sin. Postmodernity would say there's no such thing as sin. It's just, if it works best for you, go for it, do it, But granted that all humans have sinned, what is God going to do to fix it? And then hear this second question, okay? I think most churches and most of us as Christians in this culture, in this world, kind of think about Romans in terms of that first question, what I just now said. Yeah, we've sinned. Now what's God going to do about it? Here's a second question. Given that God made the world and made promises to Israel, and then through Israel, he made promises to the whole world, how in the world is God going to keep those promises given humanity's failure and the mess the world is in? How is God going to keep his promises? That's a different question than how's he going to fix it? How's he going to keep his promises? We need to understand that Romans is being written from that worldview. God is keeping his promises to the whole world. Okay? God is keeping his promises to the whole world. Not just coming down like Spider-Man and saving everything. Okay? He's keeping his promises. And when we come to Romans and we see the word righteousness, that's what it means. The righteousness of God is God keeping his promises. Not just doing good stuff all the time. God keeping his promises. That's the righteousness of God. And so whenever we hear the word righteousness and read it in Romans, we need to hear God keeps his promises. Another way to say it, and N.T. Wright will also say it this way, covenant faithfulness. God makes promises to humanity, and he keeps them. He keeps them. No matter what mess the world is in, no matter how bad it gets, God just keeps keeping his promises. Okay? And so the word justified, okay? The word justified in Romans, we're going to hear it over and over and over again. That's a big word. It's a legal term Paul used, but it's the same Greek word as righteousness. There's no difference between the two words, just an ending on the end. And being justified means being granted the righteousness of God, the covenant loyalty, promise-keeping presence of God. That's what being righteous means, is that I'm faithful to God no matter what. And I keep my promises to him. He gives me that. He gives me that ability to do that. So it's not just a status, but it's also a calling to me. When I'm justified, when I'm made righteous, I'm a promise keeper. Those guys that did that, how many years ago? 20, 30 years ago? They had some
Yeah, we're promise keepers is who we are. That's what Jesus did for us on the cross, is he turned us into promise keepers. That God said, I'll do this, send his son to die, and you're now a promise keeper. You're now a human like I made humans to be. You're a royal priest. That's what I made you to be. That's all I made you to be. Royal priests. Right? Divine, appointed royal priest in the world. And so that's what Paul's going to talk about. We got to remember that. That's what he's going to do. And another thing I think it's important for us to remember as we go through Romans is these two questions. Is God's love unconditional? How would we answer that? Is God's love unconditional? Yes, God's love is unconditional. Right? Is God's presence and blessing and life unconditional? No, it's not. Okay. Remember last week we read in chapter 1, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of salvation. In it, the righteousness of God is revealed. The covenant faithfulness of God is revealed. And then he says, but the wrath of God is revealed against all wickedness and people who do evil. Okay? You go, well, wait a minute. Sometimes God gets this, he's two-sided. He's kind of schizophrenic. Sometimes he gets mad and sometimes he doesn't, and he just goes off the handle sometimes. That's kind of the view we live with. And man, we have to do some deep dive in the Bible and with the presence of the Spirit to understand that his wrath, God is not wrath. God is holy and God is love and he is life. Wrath is a reaction. And it's merciful and it's holy and it's loving and it's judgmental. It's all those. It's mercy and it's love. God's wrath is love. And his keeping his standard and not allowing his standard to be dropped at all. That's what his wrath is. It pushes it aside. The Bible has all kinds of images. And some of them we've misunderstood and misinterpreted, you know. Every time we read fire, we think everything's gone, never again. Well, we have to be careful that we're using an image of fire. And fire can do some different things, right? Yeah. Sometimes even people up in the Smokies burn with fire and they say we're doing this to help the environment. And we're doing it, you know. And we have to be really careful that we just don't just say, God is fire, you know, and all these kinds of things. Yeah, he is, and it's a great image. And ungodliness and wickedness will be burned up. And many things will be purified, Peter says. But Peter says also in the same chapter, and then we await a new heavens and a new earth that comes, is what Peter tells us. So, we've got to keep that in mind as well as we go, that God's love is unconditional. Everybody receives God's love. God loves the ungodly. God has a heart for the ungodly. Paul's going to tell us, and Peter's going to tell us, and everybody's going to tell us. And Jesus, just watch him. Good grief. A heart for the ungodly? Oh my goodness. Just watch that guy. Listen to him talk and watch him work, and you'll see that God's love is unconditional. But his blessing is not unconditional. His life-giving presence is not unconditional. It's covenantal. I'll do this, and you do this. And it's not you do this list. It's now this will allow you to be what I made you to be. And so be what you were made to be. Now you have the freedom to be what you were made to be. It's not a list of 1, 2, 3, you do it because I did this. It's now you're freed up to be who you were made to be. Okay? Those are some of the pictures we got to have in our mind as we go through Romans. Okay, that we need to understand. In Romans 1, we mentioned last week, when you look at the first 8 chapters of Romans, think about Romans 1:17. Okay? Because 1:17 is the outline of the first 8 chapters of Romans. He says in verse 16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God for salvation for everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God, the covenant faithfulness of God, is revealed through faith for faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. So, the righteous is chapters 1 through and 3. By faith, chapter 4, will live chapter 5 through 8. Okay? So, the first part of Romans that we look at here, it's under that outline. The righteous will live by faith. If you want to know, that's what he's going to say. So the first 4 chapters, the first 3 chapters, he's going to say, who righteous? Define that for us, Paul. He said he's going to. Basically, what's he going to say? Who's righteous? Nobody. Nobody. Whoever God makes righteous, that's who's righteous. That's the only way now in this world to get righteousness is God says, you're righteous, and declares you righteous. Well, Paul's going to tell us, who does he do that for? You know? The ones who put their faith in Jesus. That's who he's going to do that for. Chapter 4 is by faith. Then chapter 5 through 8 will live. So he's going to talk, what does it mean to be alive? If you put your faith in Jesus, what does life mean? What does it mean? That's what he's going to say. And he's basically presenting a worldview. Also, just last thing we'll mention, N.T. Wright calls it Romans divided into 4 movements. And one of the things you got to remember about this guy when he teaches is he loves music. And so he uses a lot of music images. So when you're watching a play or when you're watching a musical or when you're listening to a song, sometimes you can hear the same beats or notes come through, you know. And sometimes I spent like 4 days dividing up. I had an hour, and I rewatched Les Miserables. Okay? It's my favorite musical in the whole world. Most of you know the story of me discovering that. But in Les Miserables, at the end of that, and then the same thing happened in Hamilton. I saw Hamilton, and I said, that must be something that people do who write musicals, you know. It must be the sign of a great musical. Because at Les Miserables, you know, you had all these songs that went throughout, and they were really good songs and catchy songs, and then at the end, the main character sings a song with all the songs in it. Okay? You can hear the lines of every song, and he's trying to sum up his life, and he sings a line from every song, you know? And it's like everything is coming through. And so N.T. Wright says that Romans is like that you hear these various themes and these various strands and notes, and then you'll hear them over, and you'll hear that same thing over later. And then by the time Paul gets to chapter 8, he's going to put all the songs together. He's going to put all the notes together. And it's kind of like that last song in Les Miserables, you know. And when all the songs are mentioned in one song, you know. And so you'll hear him say that, but it's 4 movements. And the movements of Romans are chapter 1 through 4, 5 through 8, with chapter 1 through 4 being divided, you know, a little bit. Chapter 5 through 8, then chapter 9 through 11. Paul kind of stops in chapter 9, and he goes, Jews, man, what can I say? I love my people so much. I love them. He just kind of stops in chapter 9 and goes, it's almost like in a play of soliloquy, you know, where he's been talking to Jews and Gentiles, and then he goes, and it comes from the fact that he's been accused a lot of saying, you hate Jews now. You're a Jew hater. He's getting tired of hearing that. He's getting tired of hearing, you hate the law. You just tell people to go sin so that have more grace. Get more grace in your life. Go do everything again. Go sin again. And he says, by no means, is his phrase. It probably was stronger in Greek than we say it in English, And he always says, we're slanderously reported, but all through this time, he just is someone who people are saying, you hate Jews, you hate the law, you hate the temple, you hate the Sabbath, you hate this. And what have we been seeing in Acts? A guy that gets on a boat and travels 3 months to get to I want to get there by Pentecost. Is one of the things that we're going to see in this chapter. And when the apostles say, could you go help in the temple with a ceremony? Absolutely. Absolutely, I'll go. And listen to him in Romans. He was a guy who probably could say out loud Psalm 119 to us. Oh, I love the law so much, Psalm 119. I love the law. The law is so beautiful, and it's so wonderful. But he's going to tell us it just can't save us. Don't make it something it can't. Okay? I love football, but football can't save me from anything. I don't need to confuse it for something that will save me. And he would say the law is wonderful and beautiful. And man, he says in Romans, look what the law did for us, but it can't save us because we can't keep it. Okay? That's one of the things that's going to come out. Then chapter 12 through 16 is his real practical, now that I've said all this, here's the problems, here's my plans, here's my, all those things. So it's 1 through 4, 5 through 8, 9 through 11, 12 through 16. And you're going to hear themes in each one of those sections. And then toward the end, he starts putting them all together. That's one of the things that N.T. Wright's going to say. So, the video we're going to watch tonight, and we'll end here. We'll be done a little bit early because it's 15 minutes long, is his overview of chapter 1 through 4. Okay? His overview of chapter 1 through 4. We hadn't really gotten to do it yet, and we'll do it next week, but one of the things that I would do is, as you go through and read Romans, just think those questions. Think, where are we? What's the problem? Who are we? I mean, those are the questions Paul addresses. Those are the questions. What time is it? And we start putting together this worldview, and it's just deeply, deeply driven into the Old Testament. Deeply into the Old Testament. Let's see. Was there anything else I was going to say? Let's just watch this video, and then next week we'll kind of talk about chapters 1 and 2 and 3. We'll read those and make some comments about that. But this is just an overview of the first movement, what he calls a movement, chapters 1 through 4. So, and real quick, let me just say, I promise you, because I told you last week, if you were here, that I would have the parts 4 and 5 of the notes. There's 4 more parts to give you. And parts 6 and 7 are done, and I almost just brought them to you to give you 6 and 7 and skip 4 and 5. But I really can't get away from this. I keep finding more and more about Eden in the Bible. And the temple in Eden, an image of Eden in the Bible. And so the whole Bible is framed, my premise is the whole Bible is framed kingdom, temple, Eden. And how does it do that? And I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, and so it's like, I can't give it to him like that. I need to add this little bit over here that I've written down. I got to get that onto the computer before I give it to him. And so, it's 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock, and I'm like, I've got to type that real quick. And then I rush it, and I just, okay, so next week I promise I'll have all that finished. Yeah. You who make promises, do you break promises, is what Paul would say. Are you not a sinner also? So anyway, it'll be finished, and but there's just a few more things. Oh man, gosh, in Genesis when it talks about in the Eden there was gold, bdellium and onyx. Why make that? Why is that sentence in there? In that land there was gold, bdellium, and onyx, you know. And you go over to the tabernacle, and there was gold, bdellium, and onyx. You know, God's making a little Eden. He's making a little bitty Eden for them, you know, for them to live around and look at, and this is the goal. This is the goal, people. This is the goal. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Then they built a big giant one, a temple, you know. And then Jesus comes along and says, this is it. And the language in the Bible is the same language all the way through. It's Eden is the description of life in the temple, is what it comes out to be. This is what life looks like when the presence of God dwells and lives. It's delight, and it's a garden, you know. And even by the end of the Revelation, it's a city in a garden. You know, God, that's one of the most amazing things about the Bible is that God built a garden, people built cities, but at the end of the Bible says, God says, I'll use your city and I'll make it a garden. I'll use y'all aren't that great at making cities, but you did a few good things, and I'm going to take it and I'm going to renew it and rebuild it and make it new, and it's going to be this beautiful city, a perfect city that you and I did together, that you and I made, you know, because that was the intention all along. It's a powerful image. Anyway, let's listen to Dr. Wright tonight.
So now that we've had a good look at the overview of Romans as a whole, I want to home in on the first of the movements of this great symphony, that is chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. And it's really important, before we get into any more detail, to understand how these 4 chapters work as a whole. There is an entire sweep to them. Paul is doing the same kind of thing, though the beginning is indeed an introduction to the whole letter, and verses 3 and 4 of chapter 1 relate really more to 5 to 8 and 9 to 11 than to 3 and 4. Nevertheless, 1 to 4 does form an entire whole. The gospel for Paul unveils, reveals the righteousness of God, the covenant justice of God, the faithfulness of God to his promises particularly to put the whole world right. I'm saying it in these different ways because this word righteousness doesn't convey all that to us unless we spell it out fairly frequently. And there are different strands that run on from chapters 1 to 4, some going into 5 to 8, some going into 9 to 11, some going into 12 to 16, and all of them mixed together. And really, if one could turn this into a symphony, that's how it would be, like a great piece by Brahms or Sibelius or somebody, with all the different strands of music weaving together and clashing and reharmonizing and so on. You have to understand Paul in general and Romans in particular much more like that than just a succession of ideas. Now he's talking about this, now he's talking about that, and so on. That's not how Paul regularly writes. And especially we see this in the sequence of thought that runs from chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, the opening statement of the gospel, through to chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Many people, when they come to Romans, and particularly the opening chapters, they jump straight to chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Not ashamed of the good news, because it's God's power bringing salvation to everyone who believes, because God's covenant justice, God's righteousness, is unveiled in it. As it says in the Bible, the just shall live by faith. And so people have often said, there we are, that's the theme of Romans. And that bit at the beginning, verses 3 and 4, about Jesus, God's Son, descended from David's seed and marked out as God's Son by the resurrection of the dead, that's just a sort of opening flourish. It falls off the front, rather. And maybe Paul needed to say it because it was a well-known creed and he wanted to establish his credentials in Rome or something like that. That's been a very common interpretation. But it is, in my view, completely mistaken. As Paul says in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, the whole point is that this good news about Jesus, David's son, now declared to be God's Son in power by the resurrection. This is the good news that brings salvation. This is the good news that carries God's power. God's power doesn't come because the missionaries go out and say, you too can be saved, or even you too can be justified by faith. The power comes when they say that Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified one, is Israel's Messiah, David's son, and he's been raised from the dead and declared to be the Lord of the whole world. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapters 1 and 2, this gospel is foolishness to the Greeks and scandalous to the Jews, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. When you announce the crucified and risen Messiah, in other words, then there is a power unleashed in the world. Paul would say the power of the Holy Spirit, which goes to work through that announcement. And that's what Paul's talking about here. The gospel is not justification by faith. The gospel is Jesus, and when you announce Jesus, then the righteousness of God is unveiled. So there are several questions which we have to hold together as we look at chapters 1 to 4 as a whole. That first one, which I've just mentioned, is all important because we need to understand the relationship between what we call Christology, what Paul says about Jesus the Messiah, and the revelation of God's righteousness. But then we have to understand the transition from 1 verses 16 and 17 through to 1:18. And often people draw a big line there in various printings of the Bible. There's a large paragraph break at that point, as though there Paul is talking about something introductory, about salvation and God's covenant faithfulness, and then here's something completely different. The wrath of God is revealed. The anger of God unveiled from heaven against all the ungodliness and injustice performed by people who use their injustice to suppress the truth. Well, is there such a break there? In the Old Testament, as we saw, not least in passages like Deuteronomy 27 to 30 and Daniel chapter 9, then it is part of the covenant faithfulness of God that he must react with extreme hostility to all the idolatry which corrupts and destroys and defaces. And in Romans 3, verses 1 to 8, Paul is talking again about the faithfulness and the truthfulness and the righteousness of God, but he includes within that the fact that God is under obligation to sort the world out, which means that where things have gone horribly wrong, where people have really messed up his world and his plan and his purposes, then God must react strongly against that. If he doesn't do that, he is not a good God. As we know in our own world, if rulers and authorities fail to react when real wickedness is afoot, then they're not actually doing what I would say is their God-ordained job. But the relationship between the revelation of righteousness and the good news of Jesus and the revelation of wrath remains a bit of a puzzle for us, to put it mildly. I think one of the ways through is to look right on to the end of that next section, which is chapter 2, verse 16, when Paul says that according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of human hearts through the Messiah Jesus. That this too is part of the gospel, the good news that God is sorting the world out. It goes back to the idea you find in some of the Psalms, like 96 or 98, where the whole creation, the trees and the animals and the sea, are celebrating because God is coming to judge the world. Judge not in the sense of God being nasty and sneering and bullying and all those horrible things, but God being the one who brings a sigh of relief to the world. At last, everything is going to be sorted out. Of course, if people are worshipping idols and if people are bullying and oppressing others and so on, then that is going to be confronted. And that will be bad news for those who behave in idolatrous and wicked ways. But the whole point is the positive one. God is coming to sort everything out. So the first two questions we have to keep in mind: first, the relationship of chapter 1, verses 3 and 4 to chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. We'll come back to that in the next section. Then the relationship of that whole introduction to this passage 1:18 to 2:16 about the revelation of the coming wrath, the wrath of God against all idolatry and wickedness. But then there's a real puzzle with the next section after that as well, namely chapter 2, verses 17 and onwards. Many commentators have seen this as Paul pointing the finger at Jews such as he himself had been and accusing them in effect of self-righteousness, of saying, well, this is not our problem. We are not tarred with this brush. We have the law, so we don't behave in these horrible ways that you've been talking about. And then it becomes a bit puzzling, because what Paul goes on to say doesn't quite make sense if you take it like that. And I think what Paul is saying there is something subtly but importantly different. And this is a difference which helps us to get right through chapters 3 and 4 as well. I think in chapter 2, verses 17 following, what he's saying is, you, the Jew, and he's talking to his own former self, if you like, you think that because you have the law, you are the one spoken of in Isaiah 49. You are the one who is to be the light to the Gentiles. You are the one who is to be the teacher of the babes and the foolish. You're the one who will be the solution to the problem. In other words, 2:17 following isn't simply saying the Jew is the exception because the Jew will keep the law, so that's all right. It's rather the Jew is God's answer to the problem. And I think the point is that in principle Paul agrees with that. He knows that's problematic, but when he says that you, the Jew, you have in the law the very form of knowledge and truth, and you celebrate the fact that God is your God, and you can make appropriate moral distinctions, you can be a guide to the blind, a light to people in darkness, a teacher of the foolish, and so on. I think Paul is saying, yeah, that was Israel's vocation. But then Israel's vocation too has gone horribly wrong. But Paul doesn't deny that that was the plan. And that's really crucial for understanding Paul's reappraisal and reappropriation of the entire Jewish theology that he had grown up with. That Israel from Abraham onwards is God's answer to, if you like, the problem of Adam. I'll come back to that later on. But Israel too has in fact gone the same way. And that goes back to Psalm 106, where it was Aaron, after all, who made the golden calf. Right at the heart of the foundation events of Israel, there was already a worm in the apple, so to speak. And you can track that all the way back to Abraham, who in one chapter has these glorious promises and believes them, and the next chapter nearly blows the whole thing and gets all sorts of things wrong. In fact, Paul now reads the whole story of the Old Testament as summed up in passages from Isaiah and Ezekiel and elsewhere, saying, actually, the story of Israel is of a people who are carrying promises of God for the world, but people who need those promises for themselves as well. And so that runs on into the start of chapter 3, where we find Paul saying, so what was the point of being Jewish in the first place? And if the Jews too, who are carrying these promises, have blown it, then how on earth is God going to be faithful to the covenant? That intensifies the problem. Interestingly, in a way that's parallel to some other Jewish writings of Paul's day, where writers writing after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 were looking at the complete debacle of God's people and saying, what has gone wrong? How on earth is God now going to be faithful to the covenant? And that's the problem which Paul is left with in the middle of chapter 3, to which then the answer comes in 3:21 and following. So here's the next little transition that you have to see as you look at chapters 1 to 4 as a whole. 3:21 and onwards is not simply the answer to the question, okay, so all humans have sinned, what's God going to do about it? It is also the answer to the question, granted that God made promises to Israel and through Israel to the world, how is God going to be faithful to those promises? And this is one of the reasons why 3:21 and following is so dense and rich. Paul is answering both those questions at once and showing that in Jesus the Messiah and in his death and resurrection, these questions rush together and are finally resolved. And this points on to the final question about how we read Romans 1 to 4 as a whole. What is the place of chapter 4? For many people, this long chapter about Abraham is simply an example from the Old Testament of somebody who's justified by faith. Here is Abraham. We'll go back to the texts. And Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Well, that's nice. So actually, in the Old Testament as well, some people are justified by faith. So that's what God is now doing with us. Well, that's better than nothing. That's better than cutting off the Old Testament and implying that Christianity was a totally new thing without any historical antecedents at all, something that Paul simply wouldn't have understood, let alone wouldn't have enjoyed. But it's actually much deeper than that, because when Paul is talking about God's faithfulness to the covenant, he has Genesis 15 in mind, as we can see from the fact that that's the chapter which goes on being expounded right the way through Romans chapter 4. So when in 3:21 following, Paul says, this is how the righteousness of God is now manifested, shown to the world, we have to take that train of thought all the way through to the end of chapter 4 and see 3:21 to 4:25 as a complete unit. This is how God has been faithful to the covenant. Well, here is the covenant, and this is the family that God promised Abraham in the first place. Underneath all of this, we find, yes, the Christology of chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, because at the very end, Paul comes back to it. In chapter 4, verses 24 following, he says that this is our faith if we believe in the one who raised from the dead Jesus our Lord, who was put to death for our trespasses and raised for our justification. So this idea of Jesus as the Messiah who sums up the promises of God to his people, and then whose resurrection declares that the job has been done, that God has been faithful, and now there is a new community of people whose sins are forgiven. This, in fact, is what has held together the whole argument from chapter 1 right the way through to chapter 4. And I think it's only when we start to get used to seeing Romans in large sections like this and understand how these great themes work, that the whole letter comes up in 3 dimensions rather than simply collapsing into our favourite little passages about this or that. So now we're almost ready to plunge in to the detailed exegesis of the beginning of the letter.
Thing to say that God makes promises to us, because what does a promise do to me? It obligates me, you know, and that is the righteousness that reveals the righteousness of God, the fact that he obligates himself to this. He's all in, you know, and that's what that's the story that Paul is telling in Romans, is that this story that we've seen in the Old Testament is about a God. It's not, it's about a people, and that's great. We need to learn from them. But it's about a God. And it's about this weird God who makes promises and obligates himself to the point of death. To the point of death. If that's what it takes. You know, and then you go to Philippians and Paul says, think about Christ, who though he was equal to God, he basically obligated himself to us. He gave up being equality with God, came to this earth, and became a slave and became a servant, and died on the cross. That's the righteousness of God. A God who would do that, And Paul says this story says he's done it and done it and done it and done it, and he just refuses to give up. And on every page, the person he's promising to doesn't do it, messes up, doesn't do it, and God does it, and God does it, and God does it, and God does it. And he's done that for the whole world and humanity. That's what he's saying there. And you know, who deserves that? That's who's righteous. What that means is, who deserves that? No one. No one. But thankfully, there's someone in charge who has the power to say, I make you that. I make you that. Because I'm the source of that. I'm the source of life, so I make you that. And yeah, so that's basically what's being said there. And that's good news, right? That's good news in this world. We are someone, we are somewhere. There's a big problem, but there's a great solution. And it's time now for us to live that solution, you know, as we walk out of here tonight and tomorrow and the next day. We go live that solution and proclaim that solution. And we're listening to a guy who's done that, you know, and who's now got something to say about it. And that's what we're hearing in Romans. So, a God who obligates himself to us to the point of death. That's the God we're talking about here, that we serve. And he says, to put it into our words, in human terms, pick up your cross and now follow me for the sake of the world. There's going to come a day that we don't have to pick up a cross anymore. We don't have to die for the sake of the world. All that's done. It's over. It's finished. But that's what we're called to here, you know. That's what we're called to here. But a day is coming when all that'll be a memory. I don't know if it'll be in some cases it'll be a good memory. In some cases it'll be, I don't really want to think about that anymore. It's all done. It's over, you know. I just want to be here with Jesus, you know. And now I can really see what I'm supposed to be and how I'm supposed to function in a new world and a new creation. So, yeah, thank you all very much. Good stuff.